Those of you who work as language translators or interpreters, or have in the past. What is the most uncomfortable/awkward conversation that you've had to convey? Story 1. My elderly parents spoke English very poorly, and I often translated for them. After my father passed away, I took my mother to the Social Security office to take care of paperwork. One of the questions they asked was whether there were any other potential beneficiaries of my father's benefits, such as other children or ex-wives. Being an only child, I immediately answered no. My mother asked me what the question was. I interpreted with my answer. She looked at me sheepishly and answered, "That's not exactly correct." It was then, at the age of 50 in the Social Security building, that I learned that my father had previously been married and had had a child. Mother and baby died during childbirth. We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description. Story 2. I recently had a similar situation while helping an elderly man with one of his U.S. naturalization applications. If you're over the age of 55 and have been a permanent resident for over 15 years, you can do the application and take the test in your first language. Anyway, his adult daughter was interpreting, but decided to answer questions on his behalf instead. I realized what was happening and reminded her that he had to answer for himself. It was a good thing, too, because it turns out the question she'd just said no to was actually a yes. The question being, have you ever served in a police unit? He hadn't mentioned to her that he'd been a policeman before she was born. If I'd simply checked no, USCIS would have found that job and accused him of lying. Being a policeman in your home country doesn't disqualify you from citizenship, but lying on the application is perjury and can get you deported. I was so relieved we dodged that bullet. Story 3. Not an actual translator, but my parents don't speak English, and I used to go with them to doctor's appointments to translate. I was 14-ish and my mom was pregnant. The NP told me to ask them when the last time they banged was, and then proceeded to tell me to translate intimate positions they could partake in while my mom was pregnant. I did not want to tell my parents or translate anything, but she kept stressing that it was good for them. I don't think my parents understood me or wanted to understand what I was trying to tell them. Story 4. Okay, so my parents are divorced and my dad is deaf. He's not the brightest fellow, so I sort of manage his medical stuff for him when his parents passed away. Now, typically, I would book a sign language interpreter for medical appointments, so I can just take notes and ask questions, but this time I didn't bother. Figured I could just interpret. Now, Dad had a new girlfriend, and I had the joy of interpreting my father's struggles with erectile dysfunction. See, his new girlfriend, who was 10 years younger, was looking for some more frequent performances than Dad could muster. So we got in depth about how frequently was appropriate for a man in his late 50s, and then had to discuss the risks of erections going on too long with the Viagra. Yeah, I always book an interpreter now, and no, I never did figure out the correct sign for an erection. Story 5. My cousin is a sign language interpreter, and he says that a big problem he and his clients have is that people talk to him rather than the client. Even at really important things like doctor appointments, the doctor will spend ages asking my cousin where he learned sign language, while the deaf client just wants to get their medical issue looked at. It's against policy for my cousin to hold their own conversation with the doctor while he's working, as he's only there to help the client understand what people are saying. He and his clients find it really frustrating and rude. So basically, if you see someone with a sign language interpreter, you can literally just ignore the interpreter, and everyone will prefer it that way, as they can just get on with their job. Also, one of his first ever clients saw his doctor was Indian and signed, "Where's my curry?" That was pretty frickin' awkward, especially when the doctor then asked what it meant. Good to know that racism is still alive and well in people who are deaf. Like, I don't know why it wouldn't be, I guess. I just figured disabled people are more marginalized, and marginalized people tend to not be so rude to other marginalized people. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, no, that's not true. So, I don't know what I was thinking. Story 6. I learned this one fast when I worked in a crisis facility and we had a long-term resident who is deaf. If I'm not looking at the deaf person, I'm not listening. I had to document the convo, so I learned to tell her whenever I needed to turn away for a moment, and to explain why if I occasionally needed to speak directly to the interpreter. My friend is an ASL interpreter, and her most awkward moment was interpreting during a legal proceeding, in which her client was being verbally abusive. She explained the importance of using appropriate facial expressions to convey tone of voice. Said it was pretty distressing ethically. The myriad of nuances in the work that interpreters do is vastly underappreciated. Story 7. I was interpreting for a high school teacher who was participating in an event to try to get dropouts to come back to high school in a majority Hispanic neighborhood. Anyway, the school gave us a list with addresses that we had to go to try and persuade the kids and parents. We go to this one house and ring the bell, and the mother answers. I start translating what the teacher was saying, and we go back and forth with the mother, asking her to see the kid. Let's call her Maria. The mom kept insisting we couldn't talk to Maria, and the teacher kept giving the whole spiel about dropping out and to think of the future, etc. About 10 minutes into the conversation, the frustrated teacher wants me to ask the mother why on earth we couldn't talk to Maria, to which the mother breaks down crying and says that she died a week before from a long illness. That's why she dropped out. What ensues is the worst and most awkward maybe 5 minutes of our lives. What ensues are the worst and most awkward maybe 5 minutes of our lives, between apologies and condolences. Needless to say, we didn't go to any other house that day. By the way, it turns out the school was aware of the kid's passing, but had forgotten to take her out of the list. Okay, on one hand, the school really screwed up here, and that really sucks. On the other, why didn't the mother just say that? I guess, I don't know, it's trauma, it's recent, but still, you could have just avoided the whole thing. Story 8. I've been on multiple medical trips to Mexico with my urologist father. Bringing translators that have little to no medical experience is incredibly difficult, and in the OR, no one knows the different names for instruments. Differs between states/countries. I've sat in on multiple appointments and surgeries with translators, and by far the worst is when my dad makes the, usually very religious, translators talk about sexual health. In addition, oftentimes people only speak Mayan in this particular village, so there has to be an English to Spanish translator and a Spanish to Mayan translator. Story 9. I wasn't a translator, but I worked at a place that captioned telephone calls for customers who were hard of hearing. We only heard one side of the phone call, then basically repeated what we heard into our voice recognition software and then corrected it on the fly. Most of the conversation were boring as hell. Old people talking to other old people. 50 people in a row calling to vote for Dancing with the Stars. But ever so rarely, you get a good one. Mine was what I'm assuming was a deaf young lady and her boyfriend, because the conversation very quickly turned from, "How are you doing?" to, "I want to tie you spread eagle on the bed and lick you all over." This continued for about 15 minutes. But the best part is all the cubicles around you hearing you loudly and very clearly speak so the voice recognition doesn't screw up graphic, depraved, intimate acts, while they are all trying to not lose their crap laughing, and still keep up captioning an old lady's cookies recipe. Story 10. I was a conversation teacher for adults in Japan who wanted to practice more natural English. Not strict formal grammar, but conversational. Not quite an interpreter, but still. One student was an 80-year-old man the others called Mr. Dictionary because his vocab was seriously exhaustive. There were very few words that could stump him, usually some type of slang. On the rare occasion he brought out a printout to ask about a new word, I would get both excited and nervous to see what it was. This was in 2007. One day he pulls out a paper and says, "I heard a news story about a scandal with an American radio host insulting some athletes. Please tell me, what does this mean?" And with all eyes in the class waiting for my wise translation, he loudly and carefully pronounced says, "Nappy-headed hose." Honestly, as an English speaker, I don't know what that means. Yeah, I know it's not nice, but I couldn't really tell ya. Story 11. I'm a translator, which means I only work with the written word, not normally anything particularly juicy. However, I once had to deal with a landlord writing to Facebook to try and get Facebook to take down derogatory comments from his tenants. Basically, the landlord was accused of giving apartments to people who would sleep with him. So I had to translate a whole bunch of comments, calling him a horn dog, saying the whole tower block has been under his desk, etc. Someone called him the Lidl version of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, which I thought was pretty hilarious. To save everyone else here time, because I had to look it up, Lidl is a furniture, a cheap furniture company. I think kind of like German IKEA. Not exactly like IKEA's shtick, but I think that's the general vibe. Story 12. There are a few. One of the worst is having to relay bad news, like cancer diagnoses, especially when the doctor is extremely blunt or hurried. As an interpreter, you cringe and wish you could just change even the tone or the insensitive wording to make it sound more humane. But you really shouldn't, because as an interpreter, your job is to relay the info as closely as possible. Another difficult situation is when you're called to a patient that is coding. This was especially difficult when I worked with pediatric patients at the children's hospital and trying to calm down the frantic parents. Another one is being called to the ER and then, upon arriving, finding out it's a person I know outside of work, like a family friend. In that situation, I would try to get someone else to interpret because of ethics, but it's a tough situation, because you want to help as much as you can while you wait on someone else to take over. I honestly could go on, but these are usually the exceptions, as I love my job. There are just some days that are way more difficult than others. translators. Story 13. Similar to others. Not an actual translator, but my parents spoke poor English when I was younger. When I was 12, they filed for bankruptcy and took me to the lawyer's office to translate for them. Having them go through and tell me everything they blew money on was extremely uncomfortable. Now, as an adult, they get offended when I don't want to take financial advice from them. Story 14. I was a Spanish medical translator for a while, and there were some pretty bad ones, but one really stands out above the rest. I followed a nurse into a room where the patient was waiting. Now, I know nothing about the patient. I'm only there to translate what the nurse says. So when the nurse says, "You're pregnant," I gave a huge smile and went, "Estás embarazada?" Patient stares in shock for a second and then bursts into tears. The nurse stammers a bit and then goes, "No bueno?" The news we had to give was bad enough, but the fact that I thought it was supposed to be a happy announcement made it 10 times cringier. I don't speak Spanish. I'm Canadian. I took French as my second language. Don't hate me. Related to the story, though, that's rough. 'Cause seriously, as a translator, how are you supposed to know? Story 15. Not the interpreter and not deaf, but I attended a comedy performance that had a female interpreter on stage with the comedian. For context, the interpreter was provided by the university, and it was the comedian's first experience being interpreted. He decided to make jokes about the situation, including at one point wondering aloud how the word bra would be signed, and watching the interpreter for the answer. She got to the important word and decided to fingerspell. I was highly amused. Story 16. A little backstory for you. Gramps on Dad's side didn't speak much English. Gran on Mom's side had been inserting herself into both of her daughters' marriages. In the past, she caused one unlucky fellow my aunt, her daughter married, to have a bad run-in with the police. She continued to insert herself into my aunt's other marriage. Said aunt was murdered by her husband. Details are fuzzy for me, but it may have had something to do with something Gran said to initiate it. Aunt and her second husband were fighting at their house alone afterwards. This story takes place when my parents and grandparents, both sides, were at a Children's Protective Services meeting. So my parents, my grandparents, the caseworker, a translator, and I think another CPS employee were in a room discussing the next steps to help my mom stop drinking and provide a better home environment for us kids. Some words were thrown by my mom's lunatic mother, who was hollering about whatever, blaming my dad for this and his parents for that, and how she misses her deceased daughters, so she's very emotional. My Gramps turned to the translator and said something in Italian. Gramps' wife and my dad understood and are surprised. The translator shook to the core. The translator was shocked, face was white, and he insisted he couldn't repeat what Gramps just said. Gramps insisted, translator refused. Gramps said, "Say it or I'll get someone else to." The translator refused again. Gramps turned to Gran, pointed a finger and shook it at her and declared, "You're the reason your daughter is dead." Gran lost it, ranted and raved and hollered to the point where she got kicked out of the meeting. CPS then told my parents they needed to divorce. Story 17. I'm not a translator, but I work in China and speak passable Mandarin. I once got a call from a Chinese friend saying that her friend, also Chinese, was on honeymoon in Hawaii and needed my help translating as she didn't speak any English. The husband had gone out for a swim and never returned, and the wife was having trouble communicating this to the police. I communicated the problem and then spent a while looking for local Chinese societies that could possibly help out, but it was past midnight and I couldn't get a hold of anyone. She was totally hysterical, so I managed to get a hotel worker to stay with her, even though she didn't speak any Mandarin. The worst part came about an hour later, when the wife called me and put me on the phone with a police officer who was asking her to go identify a body, which did turn out to be her husband's. I talked her and the other officer through the whole process and listened to the whole thing. Fortunately, a member of one of the Chinese societies in the area got in touch in the morning and took over for me, no doubt helping a lot more than I could. My Mandarin, whilst functional, wouldn't have sounded very sympathetic, and no doubt he was much more able to comfort the poor lady. Despite my Mandarin not being good enough for the situation, we got through it. It was less awkward and more tragic, however. Story 18. I'm a bilingual rep for a company. So for the most part, I have to deal with whatever crap the customer dishes out myself. For example, I had one customer who told me that he was sincerely disappointed, as in pissed, with my customer service, because the other girl who supports the language and I were non-native speakers, and he wanted a real native to support him. Basically, it was a case of, sorry bro. However, the most awkward moment so far happened today, and it was between a French customer and my translator. I know enough French to be dangerous, so I could understand enough of the conversation between them, which basically boiled down to them calling each other idiots because the customer thought that the translator told me the wrong spelling of his name. They were actually fighting while I'm sitting there as the third party thinking to myself, should I break it up? I decided the best course of action was to not employ my rusty French, could have made things worse, and browse other open cases while they worked it out. Story 19. I used to work in forensic psych. The staff office was on the floor and it had to be kept locked if nobody was in there, so the patients couldn't come in and take things to make weapons. So one evening, I worked swing. There was an ASL-trained social worker in the office talking to a deaf patient. The tech was in there with them doing some work while they sat in the corner. Eventually, the tech got up and left the office, locking it behind him and leaving the female SW locked up with a male forensic psych patient. Eventually, I got a call from a very upset social worker demanding to know why she had been locked in the office with a potentially violent patient. I went to the tech to find out what happened. He said they were off in the corner, not speaking, and he just forgot they were there and left. Story 20. The company I work for has a Spanish translation team that I use very frequently and know all of them. We basically do customer service. The most awkward conversations are when you have an irate person on the other line that is just cussing you out. Our translators are supposed to translate word for word unless vulgar language is used. Then they can summarize. Basically, what I hear is about a minute of someone screaming at me, using multiple choice words that I can recognize as curse words, then the translator translating essentially, they are not happy with your answer. It's awkward for everyone because the translator is basically getting yelled at and has nothing to do with anything, other than he picked up that call. And I have to just sit there for minutes at a time listening to someone scream, and then a short 5-word translation. The customer usually catches on after the first tirade or two that there is no point, and they should just calm down and be a decent human being and talk it out.